everybody, and welcome to another World of Warcraft live developer Q&A. Our camera has frozen. Give me 1 second. All right, round two. Welcome to another World of Warcraft live developer Q&A. This is not a chair stream, fortunately.
Yeah, exactly.
We're actually here. My name is Josh Allen, aka Community Manager Lore, joined here once again by Game Director Ian Hazzikostas. Ian, thank you so much for coming on again.
Pleasure as always, Josh.
Yep. So, we have a lot of questions to get to. We might as well just go ahead and
fresh
jump
on the
right
heels of Tides of Vengeance. Just a couple days in. It's been fun seeing everybody running around, catching up on the war campaign, murdering each other in war mode, doing assaults.
Yeah. And of course, everyone's very happy about absolutely everything. So we're going to jump right into how happy everyone is about absolutely everything. All right. This is the one where I actually get fired. First question for today.
First question.
Comes
How are
from,
you so amazing? No,
yeah, exactly. How are you so amazing? No. It comes from Giamia, I believe is how I would pronounce that, saying, you promised us better communication. Why were so many changes undocumented in 8.1, i.e. profession requirements on crafted gear and a multitude of Mythic plus mob changes? So we've been talking about communication for a long time, and that's been sort of an ongoing thing for us, is figuring out how do we continue to communicate better? How do we make sure that we actually have the ability to get answers out to you guys? How are you feeling about this today?
So I think this better doesn't necessarily mean perfect. It's a continuing process of improvement. I think, frankly, just like a lot of other people, we're also on Reddit, on MMO Champion, other places, reading the undocumented patch changes thread. Our goal is to actively make that smaller every time and to eventually reach a point where there's nothing of any seriousness or importance in there. We think that these patch notes overall were thorough. They weren't complete. There were things that weren't in them. I would say there are three categories of things that didn't make the patch notes. One set are, so the professional requirements on crafted gear, for example, that wasn't really a fully intended change in the form it took. We have several different processes for making changes to the game. Sometimes we sit around, we say, hey, we need to change the system. We need to create something new. We're going to create a new feature. We're going to create new content. In this case, we also are fixing hundreds, thousands, in fact, of bugs that are entered by our quality assurance analysts, tracked through our system every patch. And the case in profession crafted gear was, hey, a bug got entered. Unlike a gear from all past expansions, the 8.0 profession crafted BOP gear does not require that you have that profession. And that wasn't necessarily like a team-wide, deliberate, conscious decision. It was just something that was fixed as an inconsistency and done quickly without full realization that, hey, this change will make it so that people are going to log in without pants. And they might not have any pants, and that's not an acceptable thing. So there was some initial confusion on our end, and then as soon as we realized what had happened, we rolled that change back. And so, yes, we want that requirement to exist in Seasons 2 going forward, and that's plainly visible. We don't want to change your gear out from under you. So that type of change wasn't documented because it wasn't really an intended change. That's also why it was reverted. Category number 2, really minor changes. Like I mentioned, we fix literally thousands of bugs every patch. It isn't practical, and in fact, I think it would just clutter the overall patch notes if, all right, we corrected an issue where this belt clips into this other asset, or, we fixed a typo here. Like, there's a wide range of issues, and I think looking through some of the threads, some of the summaries, yes, a lot of these things listed there are changes. They're also very minor. They're not going to cause confusion or surprise or distress if they're not fully documented. And so we try to focus on issues that are larger in their importance so that when you look at the patch notes, what you see there feels relevant, and it's not just 50 pages of stuff to wade through to find the important stuff that you care about. The third category, I think, are things that we just missed, and that's where we're continuing to improve our communication process. Some of the changes like stealth detection in the mobs at the start of Underrot, that was a reflection of, those were changes that were made way back in September when people first started running the dungeons, and we just failed to properly capture those changes in our internal tracking. They were kind of off our radar by the time we got to November and assembling the patch notes. We're going to do better about that in the future. So it's the goal really is to get to a point where our patch notes are a complete record, and anything that's not in there, everyone can agree is minor.
Cool. Yeah, I know we've been talking a lot about patch notes, and we've been doing a lot of work on our end as a community team to try and make them better all the time. And even when we get feedback, like here's issues that you had with the patch notes, even still, that's the sort of thing that we can take forward and try to find better ways to improve on.
And again, I realize it's not an excuse because we owe it to you to do better. But as an explanation, I think one of the challenges for the World of Warcraft team has been evolving some of our processes as the team grows in size, as the game grows in scope. I think a lot of the things that we are accustomed to doing worked when everyone working on a feature or a piece of the game was, it was literally 5 or 6 people in a room who had full visibility into everything everyone else was doing. Now when you have dozens of people scattered across multiple offices, communication, it just becomes harder, and it's something we need to work more to accomplish.
Yep. Moving on, we actually have another question along this general topic here. This comes from Iladanka, who said, could you possibly add rationale for changes to patch notes and or hotfixes? This would be a huge step in communication and would help the community see things through your eyes. So from my end, I can say, yeah, absolutely. That's something that we want to start doing a lot more often. We do occasionally currently, but I think that's something that we could do a lot more often, is just make sure that we, the little developers notes that we'll have in there from time to time in patch notes or in hotfix notes.
Yeah, we tend to do it a lot more for class changes, where it's like we, change the scaling here and buff this and nerf this, and here's why we're trying to do that to kind of contextualize the package. But when you look at a change like Mythic Keystones can no longer be deleted, there's a lot of questions without some context on our part, and that's something we should do better.
Yeah. And that's not going to mean every single change doesn't necessarily need a developer's note attached to it. If we say, like, reduce the health of some trash mobs by 20% or something like that, I mean, the reason for that change is that they had 20% too much health. You can kind of infer that there. But that is something that we are going to be doing a lot more often going forward. Let's see. Next question here from 4PodDRV on Twitter, who said, the recent patch 8.1 broke the popular add-on Cross RP, which gave players an opt-in means to communicate in-game across faction barriers. Was this intentional, and if not, can it please be fixed?
Okay, so there was no deliberate intent to break this add-on. It was using the change that we made in Tides of Vengeance was that add-ons can no longer directly parse and do things with the chat that occurs in communities. This was done to tighten up a bunch of what were actually pretty large security loopholes and other things that could be used to harm our service if they were used by malicious authors. I know the add-on author in this case was doing it fully above board, not trying, no bad intent. So cross-faction communication is something that has a complex history, across World of Warcraft's history. There's value in, it exists to create and reinforce a certain barrier between the factions. The Alliance is the enemy, the Horde is the enemy. There's also some concerns about the potential for toxicity, where if somebody, is killing you, is corpse camping you, the communication there isn't necessarily likely to be the greatest. It's something, and so that's something that we've tried to reinforce throughout the years. Now, the reality is, it's very different when there's consent. I mean, certainly, ever since the integration of BattleNet into our game, if you have a friend who's Alliance and you're a Horde and you want to speak to them, if they're your BattleTag friend, you can talk to them. If you're in a BNet community, you can talk to them. And so we have no illusions about trying to restrict communication between people who are really fully open and consenting to it. So we did not mean to break the add-on. That said, we can't restore the functionality. What we're looking to do, and we're working on a hotfix that should give the RP community some recourse, is actually adding an in-game solution to this problem. We're looking at adding something that we're going to call probably the Elixir of Tongues, where when you drink it, you can understand the opposite faction for a period of time. You can't speak in their language, so that the key thing there is you can't force someone who doesn't want to listen to you. But if you want to understand what they're saying, then you can drink these. And so if there are role play groups that want to get together and act out a cross-faction scene. They can both use these elixirs. That way, no external add-ons are required, and hopefully, it's a simpler process overall. We're working on it right now. There's a possibility we might get it out before the weekend. If not, then likely early next week. And keep an eye on the hotfix notes for information on where it'll be available. I think we're currently thinking like a vendor in the dollar on Underbelly. This is something that's meant to be a little bit out of the way, but for those who want it and are the audience for it, you'll know where to get it and spend a few dozen gold, kind of like the Inky Black Potion, right? Just stock up, and if this is something you want to do, it's there.
Okay, and so we're actually just hot fixing that in. It's not going to require a patch or anything like that.
Correct.
Perfect. All right, moving on. Next question comes from Metalish, who asked, wondering why the change to deleting Mythic Plus keys seemed like a great quality of life change made in BFA, only to be removed quickly after implementation. What was the reason behind the change? So this is obviously talking about before Tides of Vengeance came out, you were able to, if you had a key that you didn't want to run, you were able to just delete that key and get a new one. Now you can no longer do that. You actually literally cannot delete a Mythic Keystone key, which was how it worked in Legion.
Right. In Legion, you could delete the key. You would just never get another one. And so you could just delete your key and just be out of luck for the week. So no one ever did that.
Yeah.
This is one of those changes that it was a quick change that wasn't fully thought through on our part, frankly. It was a hotfix that we made actually the day that the first Mythic Plus season began in Battle for Azeroth. It wasn't a baseline Battle for Azeroth change. Like in the 8.0 pre-patch, when you were still running Legion Mythic Plus, you still couldn't, it didn't work this way. You couldn't delete your keys and reobtain them. When there were some problems with the Keystone history carrying forward from the last Legion season into the first BFA season, that left players with some wacky Keystones, right? Someone might have gotten a 21 from their chest or whatever.
This is like the first week that Mythic Plus dungeons were available.
Exactly. And so we changed it so that you could reobtain your Keystone after deleting it as a way to allow players to sort of self-service and to solve that problem for themselves if they'd gotten into a broken or bad state where they'd failed to obtain a Keystone or they'd gotten one that was unusable. And this is a case of we just didn't fully think through the consequences. It introduced a handful of bugs, and as many players who deleted their Keystones and then found that they got a much lower level Keystone than expected the following week discovered. But it also led to emerging social issues where players would increasingly cherry pick what seemed like the easier dungeons, which also led to, even as we made changes to dungeons like Temple of Sethraliss or King's Rest, once there was already this self-selection towards dungeons like Freehold and Atal Dazar, it was very hard to shift out of that pattern. I mean, really, since the beginning of formal dungeon endgame gameplay, I'm actually talking about Burning Crusade here. We've ever since then, we've tried to point players at different dungeons, recognizing something that we saw in Burning Crusade, which we actually at the time kind of called the Mechanar problem, where there was like this one dungeon that was the easiest dungeon in the game.
Yep.
And it's what everyone ran. And they ran it not because it was the most fun. It wasn't like the best dungeon in Burning Crusade, but it was the best place to go if you wanted to get 5 badges with the minimum of fuss. And so even in Wrath of the Lich King, before Group Finder existed, when we had the heroic of the day, that was a random heroic quest from the NPC in Dalaran. And sometimes it would be, sometimes it would be Halls of Lightning, sometimes it would be Gundrak, whatever. And ever since then, we've wanted some randomization there. All that said, it's also important that there actually be some parity and that there not be dead keys, that there not be large discrepancies. Some certainly from week to week, some affixes will make some dungeons easier than others, and that's intended. But we've been keeping a close eye on the data. We're continuing to make adjustments with the goal of really ending up in a place like we did in Legion, especially by the end, where maybe there's some dungeons that you're more familiar with, some dungeons that you prefer slightly, but same ways you would do Darkheart or Halls of Valor or Maw of Souls. That's the pattern we want to settle into with Battle for Azeroth. And this is really just returning to what Mythic Plus was throughout Legion.
Yeah, and we actually have another similar question along these lines that kind of ties in here as well. It comes from Jackalope on Twitter, who said, why were the dungeon changes not in the patch notes? And why were ones made to increase challenge and change strategy without addressing pain points of other dungeons? So obviously we've talked a little bit about, it wasn't in patch notes, talking about the other side of it though as well. Why were these dungeon changes actually made?
Yeah, so the small handful that didn't make it into the patch notes were just initial changes made, not hotfixed back in September. Since then, we've actually hotfixed a ton of changes, mostly nerfs, to a wide variety of boss mechanics and things in dungeons. And that was really where our focus was. Like, if you look back at the changes made in, I would say, late October, early November, there were a large number of them across a range of dungeons, and by and large, were all designed to make the experiences a bit less punishing, looking at major pain points there. It's something we're continuing to do. We actually, in fact, have hopefully coming out at the beginning of next week a large other set of changes, mostly focusing on a range of trash abilities and trash packs. I think this week that we have going on right now, where it's teaming fortified, is probably the most punishing of the 12 affix combinations.
Right.
And that's for a couple of reasons. I think overall there is more going on with non-boss mobs in our dungeons than there was in Legion. I think in Legion there were some packs that were notoriously tricky to deal with, whether it was double bear pulls in Darkheart, or the packs at the top of the stairs in Halls of Valor that had casters that you wanted to lock down. It feels like a lot more pulls in Battle for Azeroth offer that sort of challenge. We overall think that's a good thing. Dungeons have historically, unlike raids, which are really all about boss encounters, in dungeons, the whole thing is the encounter, and figuring out how you approach dungeon enemies and how you crowd control them and what you prioritize and what you interrupt. That's a lot of the depth and interesting decision-making that goes into dungeon gameplay. And we consciously approached Battle for Azeroth wanting to get away from the default solution to 80% of your problems being AoE stun, cleave them down, move on to the next. But that's meant having to take a fresh look at things like teaming and fortifying and how they play out. So in Tides of Vengeance, we actually got, just in the last few days, we got a whole bunch of extra analytics and log data from our dungeons, because I think the systems that we had set up to monitor dungeon difficulty really were derived from Legions and mostly focused on boss encounters. We had a lot of good information on average wipe counts, encounter duration, etc. from week to week on the different boss encounters, but much less visibility into what was going on in between them. And we realized that was kind of a blind spot for us. We had anecdotal feedback from our own experience playing and from feedback we received from the community, but it's tricky to act too directly and too readily purely based on anecdotal and subjective feedback. But now, for the first time, even in the last few days, we have detailed breakdowns of the most lethal mobs in dungeons outside of bosses, which stretches of dungeons take the longest to get through, which have the highest wipe counts, especially with teaming in play. We can look at the difference between teaming and non-teaming weeks and see where teaming is introducing an artificial difficulty spike that exceeds what we're seeing elsewhere. Anyway, so that's leading to us rolling out a bunch of changes, including removing some mobs that were added in teaming, making some mobs CCable that weren't, removing infested as a possibility from some lieutenant mobs that are overly punishing when they have it, a range of changes along those lines. And so this is aimed at exactly addressing the pain points in a wide variety of dungeons, hopefully getting closer to an experience where there are challenges, but there's nothing that feels frustrating.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting to think about. You look at it from an analytics perspective. It's easy to go on the forums and see people saying like, okay, this trash pack feels too hard, or this one, I hate dealing with this one, I always want to skip this trash pack, and so on. But once you actually have like logged hard data from several thousand dungeon runs, you can then look at that and see, you can see exactly how much more difficult that trash pack is than everything else, rather than just sort of looking at it and going, okay, I guess this feels like maybe 10% too hard. You can look and see, okay, yeah, people wipe on this trash pack 11.17% more times than every other trash pack in the dungeon. So that's actually really, really interesting. Something else that you mentioned right at the start of answering this question as well that I thought was interesting, talking about changes that were made back in September. And I think that's an interesting bit of perspective on how we end up with a lot of the changes that actually go into the patch. Is a lot of times what you're seeing when we actually release content is stuff that we were working on months ago. This is like well before we were actually able to think about things like, how hard are these individual Mythic Plus dungeons and so on. So that's something that I found really interesting as well, just thinking about how long it actually does take sometimes to get changes into the game.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where always bouncing back and forth between, especially with how much we can hotfix these days, making changes in real time to the live game, working on the next upcoming milestone, working on the next one after that. And again, not an excuse, but sometimes things do slip through the cracks in that process, and we just need to get better at tracking them internally even so that that doesn't happen anymore.
Yep. All right, let's go ahead and just move straight on to the next question. This one comes from Hateful, who asked, are there any steps being taken to improve the Mythic Plus Pug experience? Currently, dungeons are extremely grueling and punishing for the casual player. It feels like without voice chat and coordination, groups just fall apart.
So, I mean, obviously, the broad changes we're making to dungeons as a whole will make them a bit more pug-friendly in some cases. That said, I think especially higher-end Mythic Keystones are intended for coordinated groups. I think it's meant to parallel endgame raid progression and coordinated PvP, where voice chat is the norm. I guess actually a question I'd ask to both Hateful and the community as a whole. I'm actually curious what we can do to improve the integrated voice chat experience, because I recognize we don't see it being used a whole lot. The first time we introduced voice chat back in 2.2 or whatever,
Sure.
it was admittedly a train wreck. Like it was difficult to set up, very poor voice quality, a lot of other problems where if you disconnected, then you also couldn't tell anyone you disconnected, etc. At this point, we're using integrated BattleNet voice chats, the same system Overwatch uses and other Blizzard games. Voice quality is pretty high. It has standard push-to-talk functionality and is integrated into parties. And I think that is designed to be that exact solution for pickup groups. Like we didn't implement voice chat with the goal of getting guilds that are happy using Discord or Mumble or whatever to stop using those and use our system. Like
Right.
if you have something that works for you, use it, go for it. But in terms of lowering the barrier to entry so that when you join a pug, it's not like, oh, I have to go download this or connect to this server and make sure, with these people I'm only going to play with possibly once ever. What can we do to make that clearer? Is it lack of visibility? Because I think we were, in some ways, didn't want to push it too heavily in your face with like a prompt that pops up every 2 seconds asking you if you want to join voice chat.
Yeah.
We didn't want to default people into voice chat because that could be jarring. Is it that people aren't aware that it's there, or you just don't want to use voice chat, period? And well, in that case, I think that there are going to be some challenges when you're looking at some higher-end content that requires real-time communication and coordination, even if it's like as simple as an interrupt rotation, being able to call on the fly, like, hey, my interrupt's on cooldown, you need to get this one. That's not going to work with text, but that's, I think something we are designing the experience around, at least at the very, very high end. Certainly,
Right.
baseline heroic dungeons, raid finder, the rest of that experience is not designed for real-time communication, but I think that's that ability for cooperation and coordination is one of the cooler parts of MMO gameplay, and so it's something we embrace when we're looking at our high-end content.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a huge part of like how guilds end up being formed and how you end up making friendships in games like WoW is you hit this difficult content. You think to yourself, okay, yeah, I want to push a 15 this week or something like that.
Yep.
And then you end up having to actually coordinate with other players and sort of make friends that way. So I think that is important. But yeah, the in-game voice chat, I also would be very interested to see what people's overall thoughts are on that.
Yeah, and if you've used it and you think it sucks, let us know that too, because we want to improve that. Right?
Yep.
Our goal is to make that an easy, convenient, functional solution.
Moving on, next question comes from Destructio, who says, why do we have to wait until the opening of the Battle for Dazara lore for the new Mythic Plus season to open? And in the same boat, why do we have to wait an extra month for the new Azeroth traits to be available? So obviously, Tides of Vengeance just released, but a lot of things are waiting for Season 2 to start at this point. That's looking to the new raid, new Mythic Plus season, new Azeroth traits, new PvP season, all of that.
So Battle of Dazara lore, it's a couple of pieces here. One, I think we think that cutting Uldir short at this point would be a bit too soon. I think Uldir just opened 3 months ago. It's a healthy 8-boss tier. Many guilds are still progressing through it, pushing for ahead of the curve, pushing for cutting edge. As we look at pacing out our raid content over the entire expansion, looking to minimize droughts, 3 months for the first raid tier would be too short, we feel. Nighthold didn't open until, I think 4.5 months or so into Legion, for example. So that's why that's there. Now, in terms of the other stuff, our endgame rewards really progress kind of in lockstep, in parallel. Mythic Plus as a system is designed to mirror raiding as an endgame, smaller group progression track. Similarly, we have our PvP season that has rewards that will progress in parallel there. It's not really like when we introduced new Mythic Plus season, all the item level cap is going up by 30. If we had that open today, people would be able to get gear that was equal to and better than everything from Battle of Desire Lore before Battle of Desire Lore was there. It would unbalance the PvP season unless PvP gear is also on that same level, and so on and so forth. So I would view seasons as a new raid tier, new Mythic Plus season, new PvP season. All those will happen at the same time as Battle for Azeroth unfolds. Second question, why wait for the new traits? That's something that we tied into the Battle of Desire Lore gear and the parallel seasonal gear. I think if we had added them to existing Uldir gear, people would have logged in and suddenly needed to immediately replace everything they previously had with, okay, go get new copies of this gear, or go get new stuff. No, that's going to happen anyway to some extent when Season 2 begins, but that's a natural part of a new season beginning and a new raid tier opening. You're going to get higher level stuff, you're going to replace what you have, versus this is all changed out from under you, and the thing that was best in slot yesterday no longer is today.
Well, and also you wouldn't necessarily want to have to replace all of your gear today, and then a new raid comes out in a month and a half, and so you just do it again right afterwards. That would just be a lot of extra stress. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Moving on, next question comes from Sammy832, who says, it'd be nice to have a source of Titan Residuum that isn't finite. I know you don't want us farming it, but can't you make the end of dungeons at least have a chance to drop some, or shards of it? It'd be nice on 0 Azerite drop raid weeks.
So I'm not sure there is a way to add a repeatable source of this that doesn't lead to a large chunk of the community just grinding their faces off on that source. The key here is that the Residuum system is viewed, it is a delivery system primarily for Mythic Keystone dungeons. Right? It was designed to solve the problem of getting Azerite only from your weekly chest was frustrating and felt like it deprived players of any sense of control. In a raid, you could bonus roll a specific boss, you could focus on a specific boss that dropped a specific piece for you. In the dungeon context, it was this wide range of items, and you might only get one every few weeks, and when you did, it might not be the slot you wanted, and so forth. So the system we have set up is, as you're running Mythic Plus, even if you do nothing else, even if you get no other sources of Azerite gear, and you never blow anything up, roughly every 2.5 weeks, you'll be able to afford a piece of gear that matches the tier of content that you're farming. So if you're doing Mythic 7s every week, 2.5 of those will give you the ability to buy currently at 370. And you can pick the slot. So if you're looking specifically for a shoulder, you're looking specifically for a helm, you can get that. And so in the current setup, that's actually probably one of the most efficient and reliable delivery systems for Azerite armor in particular of anything in the endgame. And so we're hesitant to make that even more lucrative in that context. That said, we just rolled out the system, so it's certainly possible we'll look at adding more sources of Residuum in the future, but for now, it's a dungeon-focused experience and something that we want to see how it plays out before we build on and potentially transform.
All right, cool. I'm just going to drop a sound good makes sense. We'll go ahead and move right on. Next question comes from Capitan Torpel on Twitter. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble actually pronouncing names today. This is a problem.
It's never happened before.
Never happened. No, not in the history of Q&As.
It should be the center of every Q&A bingo.
Lord
tries to pronounce the questioner's name.
Yeah. How do you plan on handling the transition from Season 1 to Season 2 regarding Titan Residuum?
So we're trying something a little different this time around compared to some of our past currencies like this. When we've had these endgame currencies like Valor or Nether Shards, and we introduced a new tier of content, in the past we would either often just hard cap what you could carry over into the next season, or we'd introduce an all-new currency, effectively resetting your old progress. We don't want to go down a road of having 4 different Titan Residuum currencies by the end of the expansion. We also dislike caps. It's sort of this awkward experience where you feel like, okay, season end is coming up, we should hoard. So what we're going to do is actually just continue to inflate as we have. There's no reset. Every tier of gear costs roughly 3 times as much as the previous one. So going from a 385 token is roughly 3 times as expensive as a 370 token. a Mythic 10 chest gives you roughly 3 times as much as a Mythic 7 chest. When Season 2 begins, well, there's just 2 new tiers being introduced. So it's 400 and 415 tier. 400 is going to cost roughly triple of what the 385 does. 415 will cost roughly triple of that. So it's basically like 10x cost going from 385 to 415. But also, the rewards from disenchanting or sharding 400s and 415s will be proportionally higher. Also, what you get out of your Season 2 weekly chest will be proportionally higher. So if you got 60 out of your Mythic 10 today, that number is going to be closer to 600 when you do a Season 2 Mythic 10, which is, of course, harder, gives you better loot. So that means that the general ratios continue to hold. It'll take you 2.5 weeks or so to buy every individual piece of gear in Season 2. And it's up to players to decide what they want to do with their currency now. If you've been struggling to find a good Mythic or to find a good Azerite helm, the system's right there for you. You can fill that hole in your character's gear. If you want to hoard all of your residuum from now until the 22nd when Battle to Zarlor opens, that might give you like a 1-week head start on the season, but it's up to you whether you would rather have something now or a fraction of an item then.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. So if you're behind in a slot, it would actually probably make a lot more sense to just go ahead and buy a piece for that slot right now, because at the very least that means you go into Season 2 with a better piece of gear. It'll make it easier.
It's
to
up to you.
clear
It depends on your goals,
initially.
right? I mean, if you're somebody, if you are, you're pushing to complete the Mythic Plus feats of strength. You're trying to do in time 10s or 15s. You want to get your gear a bit better. You're looking to get cutting edge, and you want that now. It may well be worth it for you. And it's going to be something for everyone to decide based on their own playstyle, their own preferences. Alts will view it differently than mains that are already fully decked out, and so forth.
Yeah, cool. So TLDR, buy pieces now if you want them. If not, that Titan Residuum will still be useful.
Yep. No cap, no reset. It's just costs go up, but the rewards will also go up.
Nice. Next question from Wonderful Heaven, who asked, the purpose of Artifact Knowledge is to reduce the gap between players who play a lot and those who do not. With AK on hold for 6 weeks, there will be a massive gap going into next tier that won't be easily closed for several weeks. What are your plans to prevent this in lieu of Artifact Knowledge? So referring to the mechanic that was basically increasing the rate at which your Heart of Azeroth would level up.
So this is effectively the same way it worked in Legion. If players who played through Legion may recall, initially Artifact Knowledge. Now at the time it was more transparent because you were researching it manually via work orders in your order hall. But when Legion came out, the cap on knowledge was 25. And then I want to say in 7.2 we raised it to 40. And then it just stopped there. And there might have been, you might have had more concordance levels to work towards, but knowledge had gotten you far enough to be competitive with the content that was available. So similarly, knowledge here is paced to match the available content and the needs. Right, the most powerful piece of gear available today requires a Heart of Azeroth level of 33 to fully empower. I think that's like Mythic Shoulders or Mythic Helm. And so this knowledge will get you there. Now, Season 2 is going to come out, and knowledge will resume then. I think if we had knowledge scaling in the background between now and then, in a lot of ways, you'd actually see a larger effective gap when the raid comes out. There's some people who are done with the tier, and they're taking a break, and they'll be back for Battle of Dazar'alor in Season 2, and that's totally fine. But a world where knowledge continued past what Season 1 really required would lead to people who had been grinding AP for the next month and a half, starting out the raid, being able to fully unlock all the powers of their armor, or most of them, while others who'd taken a break couldn't use anything. And yes, that gap would shrink over time, but that's a more jarring place to begin things than I think where we're going to end up. Once knowledge resumes accruing, that gap will shrink, and that is ultimately the goal. On the undocumented patch changes front, by the way, I know there's going to be skepticism here. Just to be clear, this actually wasn't a Tides of Vengeance change. This was something that when Battle for Azeroth launched, we had, okay, we're going to have 15 weeks of knowledge that increment, and unfortunately, the last week of knowledge just happened to fall on December 11th. Now, of course, we should have made this clear up front. But going into the next season, just to say it now, I forget off the top of my head exactly when the end date is, but we will announce that. Knowledge will begin accruing on January 22nd. I'd expect it to tick up for maybe 3 months or so, and then it will again pause until Season 3 begins. And so that's the system that we're currently looking at, which again matches how this worked in Legion.
Okay, and just to be clear, we're not saying that we didn't need to tell you about this. It's more that it's not that we forgot to tell you last week. It's that we forgot to tell you a while ago.
Exactly. And that's the reason why I didn't make it into the patch notes was we didn't think of it as a patch change. We didn't think of it as like, oh, we're going to consciously choose to stop increasing knowledge as part of Tides of Vengeance. Let's just not tell them. It was, oh, right, there's this system that we made 6 months ago. That's just kind of been ticking along in the background.
All right. Next question comes from Nightstalker314, who said, any plans on making the Heart of Azeroth more relevant or engaging? During Legion, we had weapons to look at and actually use, be it just for a new attack. Many players didn't hide the artifact skins via Transmog. They liked them. So why must the Heart of Azeroth feel so bland?
Okay, so lot of aspects to unpack here. Bunch of points. So yes, we have a lot of plans to make the Heart of Azeroth more engaging, and we agree that I think on several levels this fell short of what Legion artifacts offered. Baseline, some of it is on the story side. The Magni and Corruption of Azeroth storyline was more of a B plot, at least initially. It was a side plot compared to the central Horde and Alliance conflict. And while, yes, this substance Azerite is part of the war between the factions, what you're doing for Magni and the power of your heart isn't a central element of the plot in the way that your artifact weapon was a key to how you were able to overcome the Legion. That's something that's going to change as we move forward into Rise of Ashara and beyond. And so the Heart of Azeroth will become a much more central story element, and the plot line involving Magni will become much more central. And so that's part of it. Neck is inherently less visible than a weapon. At the same time, I think we wanted there to be something that sort of a permanent slot that you carry forward, that you imbue with power, that you upgrade over the course of the expansion. Didn't want to go back to weapon a second time in a row. I think there's something, I think people are enjoying being able to get a fresh set of weapons, and that's always been one of the most potent upgrades, one of the most prominent aspects of your character. And so didn't want to write off the weapon slot permanently. On the system side, we know we have a lot of work to do, and we know we want to make the Azerite system as a whole a lot better, a lot deeper, a lot more satisfying. I think reflecting, this is sort of post-mortem-y thoughts, reflecting on the system that we launched Battle for Azeroth with, I think was one central flaw that's at the heart of a lot of what feels bad about it, to the extent that it does feel bad. So on the one hand, we want artifact power to be relevant, and it's cool, I think, to have goals to work towards. I think one of the nice things about artifact power in Legion was that it gave you a sense of steady progression that complemented some of the random spikes of itemization. Right? You could clear your raid for the week and not get any upgrades, or run a dungeon and not get any upgrades. Sometimes you would, sometimes you wouldn't, but you'd always be progressing towards these meaningful goals. And what felt best about the artifact system, especially early on, was when you had, let's say, a new gold medal talent to work towards, something that was, flashy, that would meaningfully change your gameplay and give you a big boost of power. And we saw even in Legion, once players got past that, the desire for artifact power and really the appeal of the artifact on a lot of levels faded significantly. Whether you were just, leveling up Concordance or getting 0.5% to your overall stats from getting a minor trait here or there, when people were in that mode, you didn't really care about artifact power either. So on the one hand, the system works best when there are exciting goals to chase. On the other hand, because we are relying on armor and items that you replace to deliver those powers and to unlock them, it feels really, really bad if you get a new item, you get a new piece of armor from a raid, from a dungeon, from your PvP chest, and the powers on it that are interesting, that are exciting, are locked and you can't use them yet. And in fact, that would likely lead you to just keep that item in your bags and not feel like it was an upgrade right away, not feel like it was something you were supposed to use. And so that led us to give you the most potent spec modifying abilities up front. We've tuned the system at this point where they're almost unlocked by default if you're keeping pace with the heart progression overall. But what that means is all you have to look forward to by getting Azerite, by getting artifact power, is these utility abilities. And while those are handy, they're not exciting. They're not, this sort of power that's going to motivate you and excite you as you achieve these goals. And so we're kind of stuck between those two challenges as we're trying to shape the system. So where that leaves us is, as we look ahead to Rise of Ashar and beyond, we want to pretty significantly pivot how we're approaching the system. I think Battle of Dazar'alor in Season 2 is likely the last tier of Azerite armor that you'll really have to work to unlock the powers on. Thinking is, from Rise of Ashar and beyond, you'll just get new pieces. They'll be fully unlocked based on your heart level, and you can just make the choices you want to make on them. You can dial them in, customize them, and it's just armor that presents choice. And at that point, we'll shift the meaning of artifact power and the evolution of the Heart of Azeroth into something that lies in the heart itself, into ways of customizing and selecting powers that you're not re-earning, that you're just permanently unlocking and augmenting and choosing among within the heart. We'll have a lot more details of this system as Rise of Ashar gets closer. It's something we also want to use to add some more flashy visuals, even potentially some active abilities that start to feel closer to the connection that you had with the artifact weapons in Legion. And something we're excited about, but where it's a little too early to get into the details of the design. But in the months to come, we'll have a lot more to share on that front. So just wanted to kind of lay out the general philosophy for how we're approaching the challenge ahead.
Nice. That's definitely something interesting to look forward to. I'm excited to learn more about that. So we'll have to we'll make sure to share more about that as soon as we possibly can.
It might even find its way into the patch notes.
All right.
Sorry.
Next question from Silent Crits, who says, do you plan on increasing gear reward item levels of Warfronts and World Quests as time goes on? A little disappointed that the new Warfront still rewards 840 with the new raid coming out. I cannot speak today. Decreases incentive to do them. Shouldn't the gear scale up with new content? So I guess trying to reiterate that without me stuttering constantly. Are we planning on increasing the rewards from Warfronts and World Quests?
So there are different pieces there. The Arathi Warfront, that is going to remain at the level that it currently awards. Darkshore Warfront, it's actually, since it came out in advance of Season 2, once Season 2 starts, the rewards from that are going to bump up by another 15 item levels to better match the stuff from Battle of Dazar'alor. Like, we didn't want to have... We wanted there to be enough to do when Tides of Vengeance came out. Like, really, in terms of our reward structure, the default would have been the Warfront also waits until Season 2. But think of this as a preview, and so the rewards are a little bit suppressed, so they're not completely breaking our item system in the meantime. But that's how it will go forward. Now, not everything scales up, right? Like, Uldir rewards aren't getting better when Season 2 starts. I think when we have certain pieces of content that you progress through, you outgear, you leave behind. If you go back to them, you can go back to them for alts, for achievements, for cosmetic collection if you want to finish out your set. But it's not just automatically scaling up. Now, World Quest rewards over time will continue to go up in terms of their ceiling. That's derived, however, from your own personal item level. And as we've discussed in the past, some of the overall difficulty of the world also scales up a bit to match your own progression. And so that's just keeping World Quests and keeping the outdoor world relevant, but that's based on gear that you've gotten from other sources and is reflecting some increased challenge there. But Warfronts we view more like raids, where there's something that this was the Warfront for this tier, now here's a new one. Now, as we mentioned at BlizzCon, though, in Rise of Ashar, we're looking at adding heroic Warfronts. And when we do that, it's likely that both Warfronts would once again become relevant in that tier. And so for organized groups that want to go in and tackle them, that'll be a relevant reward at that time.
Okay. So the Arathi Warfront, once Season 2 starts, the Arathi Warfront will be something that you probably don't really, if you're keeping up with your gear progression at least, it's probably something you're not going to want to do for a while. But once we get around to heroic Warfronts, then it might be something that you want to go back to later. Yeah,
and again, for alts, collectors, there's a whole wide range of reasons why you would do it, but it'll be more similar to what Uldir becomes once Season 2 begins.
Okay. Makes sense. Question here from Noble N6, somewhat related, asking, can we get Warfront rotations to speed up a bit once a month to participate in a particular Warfront is kind of lame.
So in practice, that ends up being more like, I think, once every 3 weeks or so. And we looked at the rotation rate. I think the big change in Tides of Vengeance is now having 2 Warfronts that are rotating in parallel. In practice, there will be a Warfront up pretty much half the time, and every week and a half or so, you'll have a different Warfront to queue for. We're trying to balance giving everybody a chance to participate with the speed of the overall rotation. I think, when it pops, it's up for a week because many people only log in on weekends. Many people, log in at different times during the week. We want to avoid for such a central piece of content the sense that, oh, you just missed this Warfront. Sorry, come back later. Different pieces of content have different levels of availability. On the other end of the spectrum, we have assaults that are up for 6 hours, then off for 12 or 13, where, if you miss it, it might happen while you were at work. There'll be another one tomorrow that's hopefully at a more convenient time.
So how does that Warfront, the like Arathi sometimes being available, Darkshore sometimes being available, how does that factor in with the gear rewards being there? Because obviously, once Season 2 starts especially, I think most of the people who are really keeping up are going to only want to do the Darkshore Warfront. So having the Arathi one coming up 2 weeks later doesn't really
That's
that
fair.
much?
I mean, I think it depends on it. There's other types of rewards from the system as a whole, though, too, right? There's artifact power from turn-ins, there's war resources from doing the outdoor content. But yes, in terms of if you're just looking for that one piece of gear, then the best stuff in Season 2 is going to be you get to alternate, doing the Darkshore Warfront, getting what will be a guaranteed eye-level 400 piece, and then killing the Darkshore World Boss for a chance at another 400 piece, and that will be every other week. Ultimately, I think clearly, obviously, it would be great to get the rewards more frequently, but they reward in the way they do in part because they're as infrequent as they are. I think if you could do a Warfront every 3 or 4 days, we probably wouldn't be able to let you get an eye-level 400 piece, let's say, from it in Season 2, because that would obsolete large swaths of other content like Mythic Plus and rating in terms of relative availability.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. This one comes from Heaton, who asked, as a Horde player on a Horde-dominant server, I will never see the 30% Warmode bonus. This is a problem. I guess it's also not really a question. It's more of a statement.
Fair. So I guess one clarification. So there's nothing server-specific about this system. Warmode and Warmode balance are region-wide. So the entirety of North America, the entirety of Europe. It doesn't matter whether your server is Horde or Alliance dominated. The way the system works is every weekly reset, so Tuesday mornings in North America, Wednesday mornings in Europe, Thursday mornings in Asia, the system looks at what the relative balance was in participation between the two factions in Warmode during the prior week, and will dynamically adjust the bonuses. So hopefully if more Alliance participate, it's likely that we'll see the Alliance bonus actually start to trickle down a little bit from 30 to 25 to 20. I would be surprised if we ever saw a 30% Horde bonus, but it's possible. If more Alliance than Horde are queuing or participating in Warmode in a given week, Horde will have a larger bonus to participate than Alliance will. Obviously, we're at the other end of the spectrum there now. And so I think, and this is part of, this system as a whole, of course, is we're looking to address and to restore overall balance in the system. I think when Warmode first came out in early Battle for Azeroth, ratios and participation were actually pretty good. However, we had some bugs and other quirks with the way we were setting up our Warmode and balancing the shards that led to sort of snowballing effects of Alliance feeling outnumbered by Horde, turning off Warmode, and that becoming more and more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think looking at the initial interest and participation in Warmode, there is enough interest and demand on both sides to make for a healthy balance across our shards. And it's been awesome, actually. We've seen a lot of that in the last couple of days even. The Assaults have done a great job of bringing people in Warmode who are looking for world PvP together. And we're seeing more and more Alliance turning on Warmode and having fun doing it and having success doing it.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, despite the hat, I'm going to be honest, I've been playing Alliance this expansion, and I've been actually enjoying going out there in Warmode and getting beat on extensively. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next question. 1 second here. Sorry about that. So next question comes from Corina, who says, in 8.1, we will be able to acquire some rewards from island expeditions with currency, but this doesn't include the items that were available before 8.1. Will the previous items be added to the vendor at some point?
So I think island rewards are something that will continue to evolve over the course of the expansion. So we recognize that as time goes on for collectors, you may come down to just wanting a small handful of specific things to complete your collection. So it's likely that we'll use this vendor or another system to allow for more specific targeting of the last few pieces that you need before the expansion's over. But right now, it's more there to just complement overall acquisition. And as time goes on, it's likely we'll evolve that focus, but nothing specific to announce right now.
Okay. And just as a side note, I do want to apologize for the camera issues that we're having. For what it's worth, I do have a long list of improvements that are coming for the studio. New camera just moved to the top of that list, so we will be making sure that we do not have these issues in the future. Moving on to the next question. This one comes from Rick Rose, who said it was previously mentioned by Ithasins. Yeah, I don't think I've ever actually tried to pronounce his name before. I've read it, but I don't know if I've ever tried to pronounce it. Ithasins, whatever. It was previously mentioned by Ithasins back in September that new ways to obtain vicious saddles were being worked on for 8.1. What are they?
So, straightforward answer here. In Season 2, so you have your overall participation progress bar that shows your progression towards the seasonal mount. In Season 2, once you fill that up and earn the Season 2 exclusive mount, the bar will just reset, except at the end, this time will be a vicious saddle. And you can refill that as many times as you want during the season, getting vicious saddles by doing that. So just earn your season-specific mount that's only available during that season first, and then continue playing for saddles.
Cool. Easy peasy, straightforward. Next question from Coils, asking kind of a broad question here. The question is, are you satisfied with the state of class design as a whole? The community seems to have a negative opinion on this topic lately.
So, no, we're never truly satisfied with the state of class design. It's hard to imagine a world where we say, like, yep, we're done, mission accomplished,
right,
walking away, these are the classes. It's something we grapple with on a lot of levels. Macro level, I think there was definitely a change in our philosophy on class design as a team, really about 8 years ago, I would say. I think as we started for the first time looking to streamline, looking to manage the scope of what a class entailed. For the first few years of World of Warcraft, every expansion was, all right, here's a bunch of new spells and talents. Here's a bunch of new spells and talents. And then we were starting to get to a point where, on a few levels, like literally action bar space, keybind space, just the conceptual, the scope of a given class, those things were starting to hit their limits. We were, approaching class design for an expansion saying, all right, we need to add 3 new things to this class because they're getting 5 new levels or whatever. And it wasn't clear what the classes actually needed. And it's like, they have all of these tools. We can start giving them more things that are directly eroding at the uniqueness of other classes just in the name of piling on more abilities. And we recognized the harm that was causing and started to pull away from there. Now I recognize, from the perspective of an individual player of an individual class, getting new stuff is cool and is exciting. And we lost something big by pulling away from it. From an individual player's perspective, I think for the state of balance in the game as a whole, from a sense of class uniqueness, spec uniqueness, because really in a lot of ways, increasingly these days, we effectively have 36 distinct classes. I think 10 years ago, it was a question of like, are mages good this patch? Are rogues good this patch? Whereas now it's, well, is Frost good? Is Fire good? Is Subtlety good? Is Outlaw good? Or is it fun? And so it's a more complicated solution space. And part of what we've settled on the last couple of expansions is, all right, we're not going to add a ton of baseline functionality to classes. We're going to have deep expansion-specific systems that add new modifications to your class abilities, give you some new toys to play with, but aren't permanently growing that space. And that, I think part of what we're seeing is that's not as satisfying as we'd hoped in a long-term sense. But a lot of the time we grapple with, and this is our perspective in working on a game that's entering its 15th year, we are grappling with short-term excitement versus long-term cohesion and sustainability. And there's a little bit of gun shyness from being burned from past mistakes of, man, we did this thing that was super exciting at the time, but wow, this is having long-term challenges to balance. How do we clean this up? Where do we go from here? That often makes us more conservative. And in practice, we realize that that can lead to short-term dissatisfaction, and that's something we are continually talking about, continually grappling with. The so-called pruning that happened in Warlords and Legion was I think very, very controversial, very contentious at the time. I think in Battle for Azeroth, we've taken a step back from that. We certainly weren't looking to contract further. We, if anything, re-added pieces of utility, whether it's tools like Enrage dispels, things like raid buffs, and we're not sitting around currently thinking, oh, our classes and specs have too many abilities, too much going on, we need to simplify. That's not where we're at. The separate piece of it that I think we also grapple with a lot is keeping up with the dynamic nature of community perception and the metagame that these things dictate, which is much of which is driven by our content design, much of which is driven by the PvP meta. When all it takes is a couple of raid bosses that very heavily emphasize a certain ability or a certain damage profile, whether it's burst AoE or split cleave or whatever, and suddenly these classes become much more favored in representation. That trickles down to what pug leaders are looking for, and at the end of the day, a lot of the core complaints are driven by a sense of individuals just wanting to find a home in groups, wanting to find a spot in pugs, and being turned down. All of that is stuff we need to work on, and it's a mix of class-specific issues where we can say, okay, feral druids they feel very weak when it comes to AoE damage, and that makes them undesirable in dungeons. And while we don't want AoE damage to be a strength for that spec, it can't be a prohibitive weakness. Let's address that. Those are in many ways the easier problems to solve. The tougher ones are just the overall challenge of keeping 36 specs feeling distinct and unique, but also relevant. And so, that's where utility comes in. That's where, that's also an ongoing conversation between class and encounter design as we look to actively create situations in our raids, in our dungeons, that highlight and emphasize the abilities that are unique to certain specs or certain classes so that they can feel valued. And it's not just a question of who's bringing the most damage, because there's always going to be someone, no matter what we do balance-wise, there's always going to be some bar that's at the top. But if people are all bringing different tools and those tools are all valued in different situations, that feels like a more sustainable state that we can hope to achieve.
Okay. And next question, which I actually accidentally went to a little bit early there, comes from Forsey, who asked, can we expect any form of legendaries throughout BFA, for example, Mystic Pandaria cloaks, Warlords of Draenor rings, the way that those worked? Obviously, it was very different from how, very different from how Legion legendaries worked, where those were just everywhere. But then even legendaries prior to that, where those were more of a quest line that you built up to.
I think nothing specific planned right now, but it's always possible where it makes sense. I think we had that bonus legendary from Argus in Antorus that was just a rare little surprise that some people could come across. I think where it fits the story, where it fits the content we're doing, it's something we're always open to, but nothing specific planned right now.
All right. And I believe we got time for one more question. We'll grab this one here from Mamea, who said, what's the status on uncoupling artifact pairs for Transmog? I really want to mog shield and sword separately on my prop pally.
So unfortunately, nothing new to announce on this right now. We did a bunch of work to let artifact transmogging work at all. And because there's some, it's a wide range of things that break the normal transmog rules. Like, we want you to be able to transmog into your two-handed mace if you're a holy paladin, even though in practice you're probably using a one-hander and shield with different animations and a different overall look. And a key part of that, to say nothing of things like the Demonology Warlock Skull, and a key part of that was just in terms of how it was designed and implemented. The artifact is a single thing that just kind of stomps on both of your equipped slots.
Right.
And that's what lets it override a lot of these restrictions. So it's not clear how we'd roll that back without also breaking some other parts of it. It's something we'd like to do. We totally recognize that, during Legion, if you were an enhancement shaman, you may want half of your Doomhammer transmog and half being something else, or same deal with the shield and the sword on prop pally. But there's no, in terms of the technical implementation, we don't have a clear path to get from where we are now to a situation that's the best of both worlds. But it's not something we are saying definitively no on, just
Sure.
not right now.
Okay. Well, that pretty much wraps up all the time that we have here today. Thanks, Ian, so much for coming on here.
Anytime.
Sticking through the camera issues and so on.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Sorry about the technical difficulties.
Yeah, no, that's 100% my fault. We will have that fixed for the next time we do one of these, which, by the way, we did get, I was able to confirm we've got another one in the works for looking for early January. We're going to actually have some people on here to talk about some story and lore focused stuff. So
cool.
Keep an eye out for an official announcement on that. But until next time.
Yeah. Merry Wintervale. And
Merry Wintervale.
I will see you all in 2019.
See it.